questions. So first off, I just want to introduce myself and thank you so much for joining. Welcome to the 9th installment of the Digital Campfire Download. I can't believe it's been 9. The series where I talk to the creatives and the entrepreneurs who are building and stoking the world's most interesting digital campfires right now, but also the experts who can really shed some light on this incredible topic. I'm Sarah Wilson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a digital strategist based in LA. I created the term digital campfire to refer to a type of online destination that's more intimate, more private, and more interactive than the public-facing social platforms. And I launched this series to really meet all of the forces behind those hyper-engaged digital campfires and really understand what are the forces that are like actually underneath them as well. And I think this interview today I'm really excited about because that's going to teach us a lot about kind of the cultural shifts that are shaping a lot of this. So I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce my guest today, but just a quick bit of housekeeping first. As I said, I've muted all of you, so if you can't talk, that's why. The conversation is going to run about 35 to 40 minutes, and you're going to have the chance to ask questions at the end, so you're absolutely welcome. Feel free to ask questions, though, throughout the interview via the little chat feature in Zoom, and when I open it up for questions, I'll do my best to get to them. Or you can also raise your hand and come right into the conversation at the end. I'll call on you. It's a fun way to participate as well. This is also going to be recorded and shared out afterwards. And one last thing is that I'm doing this from home like everyone. So if we get disconnected, who knows? It hasn't happened yet. Just dial back in, but just wanted to give that little PSA. So now on to my guest for today. We've all heard the stats about the decline of institutional religion. Stats like attendance at traditional religious congregations is lower than it's ever been, or religiously unaffiliated people, the share of that population is growing at a rapid clip. What a lot of those stats miss, I think, is that as traditional religious institutions and affiliations decline, people are searching for other types of meaning to fill this void. Our hunger for meaning remains extremely strong. Indeed, there are more people than ever today who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. So what does that mean exactly? And how is spirituality playing out in our lives today? My guest today has devoted his life's work to investigating that question. As a ministry innovation fellow at Harvard Divinity School and the co-founder of the startup Sacred Design Lab, which is a research and design consultancy that works to create a culture of belonging and becoming, he has immersed himself in the seismic changes that are really transforming the way we seek spirituality and meaning today. Specifically, how this meaning is being packaged up in different ways for a new generation. His new book, The Power of Ritual, Turning Everyday Activities into Soulful Practices, explores how we can reimagine tradition and ritual for a modern context. As I mentioned, I put the link to buy the book in the chat, and stay tuned for info on how you can get one of 3 free copies at the end of the interview. So please welcome, with that long preamble, please welcome Casper Turkile. And please correct me if I messed up your name.
You nailed it.
I did my best. Okay, great.
You nailed it.
Fantastic. I'm sure it's not common. I was like, I'm gonna write it out and have it be right in front of me. So thank you so much for joining, Casper. So I want to call you like a spiritual anthropologist, but I also saw on Twitter the other day someone called you the Elton John of spirituality. So like, which do you prefer?
Becoming the Elton John of spirituality. I feel like there's still some way to travel, but I've really embraced that. I don't know if it was a read or if it was a compliment, but I'm fully embracing it.
Amazing. I think it's great. I think you just sort of lean into that path. I'm all for it. So The Power of Ritual, let's talk about this book. It's a roadmap for finding greater meaning in life through community in many ways. Why, and then ritual being sort of the doorway into that. Why do you feel like community is so important? I know it's a broad question, but I want to kick it off because it's part of what you've really devoted your life to.
Thanks, Sarah. And let me just say, there are so many experts on this phone call that I am already looking forward to the conversation that is to come. Yes, why is community important? I mean, without it, we die. I mean, that's kind of how simple it is.
Yeah.
We are social creatures, and yet more and more we live in a culture that's focused on our individual identities. And there's two important concepts that are helpful to differentiate. One is social isolation, which are the structural forces that means we are spending more time on our own. So working from home was one of the trends. Of course, that's just been amped up to 100.
Right.
Higher rates of divorce, higher rates of people living on their own. And many of these things on their own can be experienced as a great thing. So I'm not like anti living on your own. But so those are the kind of structural ways in which we are more on our own. And then loneliness is the experience of the difference between the relationships that we want to have and the relationships that we have. So loneliness is really a much more qualitative kind of indicator, so that you could be surrounded by people, whether it's, you know, you're in a marriage, or you have many of housemates, you're in a classroom, you're at a party, and yet you feel disconnected. And so both of those indicators have been rising, and of course they're connected. And so community is an answer to both of them. I think one of the really interesting questions is, what does community look like to fulfill us, both on a social isolation side and on a loneliness side? So, you know, more co-housing, more time spent together in leisure activities, right? Those can all be great answers to the former. But especially during quarantine, what are ways that we can feel connected even when we physically are not able to have those kind of structural connections is a real design challenge. So one of the reasons why I wrote the book is because I feel like there's so many useful strategies to experience that kind of connection in our religious traditions, in ancient wisdom, whether it's the kind of physical practices of dancing together or praying together, or whether it's the ways in which we engage text and feel connected to ancestors. There's so many things that maybe in our everyday life we don't feel like we have access to. And I wanted to hopefully invite readers into thinking about some ways of connecting that they might not have explored before.
Yeah, I want to get into the specifics here, because I think it's super interesting how you, this concept of unbundling. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought it was such an interesting analogy to apply to this world.
It's really helped me understand what's happening at a big picture. You talked about the decreasing affiliation stats. You know, 40% of millennials now say in America that they are unaffiliated to a religious tradition. We think that number will go as high as perhaps 50% for Gen Z. So there's a massive shift in our kind of religious culture. And as you said, it's not that people like suddenly uninterested in meaning or connection, but the relationship with institutions that have traditionally taken care of our religious and spiritual lives, that's where the disconnection is. So a good example to understand that unbundling context is the newspaper. So if you think a newspaper is a bundle of all sorts of different value offerings, you have the latest headlines, you've got your sports scores, you've got your personal ads, house prices, travel ideas, all of them are bundled up in one product. And what's happened over the last couple of decades is that each of those offerings has become a standalone app, which is better than the job that the newspaper does. So you can get immediate headlines on your CNN app. You can watch the live game on your ESPN app, right? All of those do a better job. And so that original product has been unbundled. And that's why the newspaper has struggled so much. That doesn't mean that the newspaper doesn't still have a job to do. I subscribe to a couple of print publications specifically for the moment on Saturday morning when I wake up and I'm not using any screens, and I just like luxuriously read the London Review of Books, and I feel like I'm an intellectual. And so so it still has a job to do, but it's not the job it was originally meant to do. So the question then becomes, are we just going to stick with each of those individual apps? Because in our religious and spiritual lives, the analogy that we think about is that everyone has their own personalized collection, right? You might use the Headspace app, and you've got a hiking trail app, and you've got whatever collection of individual products you have in your life, but no one shares the exact mix. And so we lose that sense of a community that has a shared set of practices. And I think that's one of the drivers towards the experience of social isolation or loneliness that we're in. So one of the big design questions is, how are we going to rebundle all of those different spiritual offerings to help us feel connected?
It's such an interesting way of framing it. When I think of unbundling, it also, there's a part of it that sounds very lonely. I mean, we're all sort of experiencing our own universe. And so how does ritual actually connect you to something bigger? You sort of broke it down into 4 different pieces that I thought were really helpful in explaining that.
Yeah, so the way I kind of structured the book was about 4 levels of connection: connecting with yourself, connecting with other people, connecting with the natural world, and connecting with transcendence. Now, my colleagues at Sacred Design Lab and I always joke that the soul cannot be desecrated. So the very idea of breaking things into these categories is somewhat of like just a little helping hand to, because they're so connected, right? They're so interrelated. But nonetheless, it's a helpful framework, I think. And in each of those categories, there are practices that we can adopt or that we can translate that help us feel connected. So one of my favorites, for example, is the practice of eating together as a strategy of feeling connected. It's not rocket science, right? That's one of the things to take away, is these things are not overly complex. But sharing a meal and making an intentional moment of connection around the dinner table, whether it's lighting candles together or singing a song together, or just, you know, some friends who I know hold one another's hands and just say out loud, "It's good to be together," and then eat. So it's just little moments of setting that kind of ritual intention can be really helpful strategies.
Yeah, really, really helpful. I also love how you talk, it's a very inclusive view of spirituality. It's actually one of the most inclusive views that I've ever come across. You know, it explicitly, you write for spiritual beginners, which I love.
Yes.
Why do you think that's important right now?
Well, one of the narratives, I think, around religion and spirituality is that it's, I don't want to say unapproachable, but complex. That it demands years of training. That it only happens in very beautiful places with gorgeous windows. That maybe it happens in another language. So there's many barriers, I think, that a lot of us feel, and of course there's been real strategies of intentional exclusion as well, certainly to LGBT people and various others. So that's kind of the background. The other element for me that was really important was not to like have something added to your to-do list, right? Like, oh, now I'm going to become spiritual and I'm going to go on this, 30-day retreat. Like, good for you, right? Like, if that's where you're at, amazing. But I really wanted to affirm people's everyday experience and to invite people to look at those moments as a pathway into spiritual depth. And so the whole orientation of the book is to say, look at the things you're already doing and find the moments which are already kind of holding meaning, whether it's snuggling your kids before bedtime, whether it's cooking a favorite recipe, your favorite walk around the neighborhood, and see those moments as a potential location for a spiritual practice. And not that everything has to become a spiritual practice, because that demands a whole different life. But to really look at our daily lives as the location in which spirituality happens. You don't have to go to Thailand and take ayahuasca in Peru.
Right. Although, just that could be fun too. I love that the way you frame it is ritual spotting. This idea of like ritual is everywhere, and it's really just about ritual and spirituality. It's about noticing. It strikes me it's about noticing as much as anything else.
Yeah, and honestly, believing that it's possible. I think one of the big things that feels important, especially for people who maybe weren't raised with a religious background, is to think that even they might have a spiritual life. I think there's some of the narratives within institutional religion. I'm thinking especially of Christian colleagues who work for a denomination or for a congregation. There's a real hope that people will come back at some point. And of course, a growing number of people were never there in the first place. And so we've had, for a large number of people, a kind of disconnect within a tradition as it passed down from generation to generation. So there's even, I think, a job to be done, and I hope the book can do some of this, to help people imagine that they might have an authentic spiritual life and something to draw on. So there's an invitational element to the book, which I hope resonates as well.
So how do you know you're in it? How do you know you've hit on this moment of, that sort of this window of ritual into sacred, meaning and spirituality and connection, you've mentioned vulnerability being a part of it and sort of feeling that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear what your experience has been as well, Sarah. But I'll give a first response. One of the ways for me personally, because I'm like a very self-obsessed person, is when I know I'm not thinking about myself. So that's like my most helpful go-to.
That's a great marker. We should give that to many of our political leaders. I'm sure that would be a great, okay.
But I'm serious, like it's really the moments when I'm like, oh, I haven't been thinking about me for a minute. Like something must have happened. And one of the ways that happens frequently is when I'm singing with other people. That it's one of the most impactful spiritual practices in my life. And I wouldn't have called it a spiritual practice before. I would have just called it going to choir, or, you know, maybe with some friends, someone gets a guitar out and people start singing. But the moment I was like, oh, when I'm singing with other people, my consciousness, it goes from me to we, right? Like I just have a bigger sense of who I am because I'm conscious of who we are. And that decentering of the individual, I think in this moment, in this culture, is a really powerful way of noticing when we're interrupted by a different conception of reality, right? That the idea that there is another world, but it's the same as this one. But I'm curious, how about for you? Like, when have you noticed when you're like, oh, I'm really connected in a deeper way right now?
It's always in nature. It's always getting outside. So I really connect with that part of your book where you talk about sort of as one of the 4 pieces is getting outside. And obviously I think everybody's worlds have just sort of truncated and you know, become much smaller in the past 3 months, 4 months. And so nature, sort of, you have to figure out what that means to you. Maybe it's walking from, you know, the end of your driveway to the end of your street and there's a tree. Like, I mean, that might be it. And I feel lucky enough to have a street to call home. Like, do you know what I mean? And so it's just noticing and being aware of that has really been helpful. But, you know, my whole beat, what I talk about is digital campfires and sort of looking at those digital connections. And so when I was reading your passage, your part about sort of vulnerability, I thought, well, okay, so by definition, the spiritual is a place of vulnerable connection. I've talked to so many community leaders and people who've built digital campfires. And by this definition, I guess it's like every time I post in a raw or a real way in a Facebook group for, you know, Forever 35 podcast or whatever, am I engaging in a spiritual act? Like, is that, if I'm being my sort of vulnerable self, like help me tease that out and define that? Or is it more about sort of a space that you're creating for yourself?
That's a really interesting question. My instinct is to say, just because we're vulnerable doesn't necessarily mean that we're in the midst of a spiritual experience. I mean, vulnerability can be, you know, since Brené Brown, God love her, we're all on the emotional vulnerability train, which is amazing.
Well, we also now have the language to talk about it in a way I think we didn't before, but yes.
I completely agree, agree. And of course you want to have a mix of safety in there too. But so I guess what would make it a vulnerable experience, one that's spiritually oriented? I think for me, it would be, I don't know, this is maybe one answer, but like especially if it's an interpersonal experience of vulnerability, that it's held within something bigger. So it's not just me telling you, you know, I'm leaving my marriage, I don't know, or like I have a diagnosis. I feel like there would need to be something around us that would hold it, whether it's
like holding,
yeah, so for example, it might be within an orientation of a kind of a regular conversation, which is there to help us not get lost in our own egos. Maybe that's one of them. And I talk about the confession group as one of the tools for that in the book, where, you know, this was an experience I'd had where regularly over every month over a couple of years, I got together with the same group of friends and we shared the things that we didn't share anywhere else. Like we were often leaders in front of a group where you have to model vulnerability, right? Which is appropriate and safe, and that's how it should be. But we didn't actually ever share the real stuff in those contexts because you're responsible for the group. So I guess if there's a sort of a discipline of a conversation of vulnerability, which is not just about sharing information, but which is about kind of laying out what we have in I'm going to use theological language, but like before a divine gaze, right? So it's not even me like sharing secrets with you, like that's not so much the vibe, but it's about offering up the life that I'm living in front of something bigger than myself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think I understand. I almost need a visual, so maybe we can do one together.
Yeah,
I mean,
but I love that. Like if you think about an altar, right? Or if you think about an offering table, like if we're not like injecting like the information into someone, but we're showing like the reality and its messiness in front of a divine eye. Maybe that's a good image.
Yeah, also just divine eye. I think that should come up more in these interviews. So in 2015, I didn't even mention this seminal paper you wrote, How We Gather. And, you know, it was all about how people are building communities of meaning in secular spaces. And I will quote you as saying, millennials are looking for spirituality and community in combination, and they feel they can't lead a meaningful life without it. Do you think that this search for spirituality and community in sort of spaces outside religion is the new normal? Like, is it growing? Is it like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's definitely normal for a certain segment of the population. So, and certainly the numbers are growing. I mean, just in terms of the number of people, even if you look at workplaces, the number of younger people who are showing up at work with an expectation that the work is going to be meaningful, purposeful, and inherently relational, that's a real major shift just within a generation that employers are now having to orient themselves around differently. So that's one example. I mean, I think it makes sense that folks who are outside of institutions are looking elsewhere, because my assumption, and I think not incorrectly, is that we are inherently meaning-making creatures, and so we're trying to find meaning somehow, somewhere. One of the interesting things is who we assume has the answers, or like who we trust to help us ask the questions, because so often religious leaders will be like, but what they're asking for, we have. Why aren't they coming? And in large part, there's just a real trust gap. And so instead, people are going to seek out therapists, or they are looking to artists and musicians, for example, or there's a real sense of people who have lived it themselves, who I can trust and follow because I see it in how they act and how they be. So certainly there's a shifting location, I think, of trust. And one of my friends, Danya Schultz, had a great line which really resonated, which is that increasingly people don't want to affiliate with an institution, but they want to affiliate with an individual. And so that sense of kind of the Instagram influencer, I think, also applies in a spirituality context. So those are some of the kind of cultural trends that definitely feel real.
Yeah, definitely. What you said just now reminds me a lot of, you know, you talk a lot about Soul Cycle. I think about Peloton. You know, even in Peloton's recent, I believe it was a filing that they had. It talked about essentially that the power of their instructors to build this brand, and people are connecting to that and feeling as if they're in community. I want to get to that because I think there's so much there that brands can take from this and do it in an authentic way. But I actually want to ask you, like, you know, online versus off. Your book was written obviously before COVID hit, and one of the four kind of pieces of it that you talk about is, you know, connecting with people. It's very hard to do that now, especially if you live alone. And, you know, I was reading an article the other day in the Times about throwing a COVID barbecue. And I know it was supposed to be like creative and everything, but I got so depressed. It was just like, here are all the ways we didn't touch. It was just like, oh my God, this is what it is. Okay. And so I wonder, to what extent do you feel that this is actually possible in this world that we're living in now, which is all digital, 90%, so much more digital than it was?
Yeah, and that's the key, I think. So one of the things I've long been really interested in is the idea of concentric circles of relationships. So we have our kind of most intimate people, maybe up to 5 folks, right? People you can call at 3 a.m. and they'll do whatever you need them to do. You have kind of a community of maybe 150, right? That Dunbar number. And then you have the crowd. And the traditional structures of community, both religious in the sense of congregations, but also if you think about old structures like the Lions or the Rotary Club, or you know, they kind of sat in that middle circle And that's the structure that just does not work in a COVID world. It certainly doesn't, right? You can try and replicate it, but it's just always going to be disappointing. So the way I've been thinking about it is, how can we focus really well on that inner circle and on that outer circle? Because I think digitally you can do that outer circle really well. You can have little sweet moments of connection, like a little joke. Something can be a fun experience. You don't ever have to see that person again. Drinks, reunions, whatever. Like it's relatively, or even like if we go into a kind of, whether it's happening in Fortnite or it's happening in a different sort of platform, really interesting experiences where we feel that connection to a crowd. The inner circle, I think that's the one that could work in a COVID world safely. If you have your kind of quarantine or your COVID crew or whatever it is, right? Whether that's the people you physically live with, or it's neighbors who are still relatively close by, that you can say, okay, we're going to make a, what's the word that I'm looking for?
A quarantine?
There was another one which has popped out of my brain, but someone is going to write it in the chat. I know.
Okay.
Pod. Thank you, Rebecca.
Oh, yeah, pod.
So to build your pod, and that's the crew that you can say, okay, we're going to have touch essentially and have that safely. Because one of the things that often is a misnomer, I think, when we're talking about loneliness, is that people think, oh, we need to have strong new connections. And often the best way of really building an experience of belonging is to go deeper with the people we already have and know. So there's an opportunity, I think, of going deeper with a small crew of people. But for that, you need, new conversations to have. So you're not just talking about politics and COVID, or whatever it is. But that's a strategy, I think, that in this world is a more likely one to succeed, rather than replicating the kind of, family barbecue necessarily.
Right. No, I think that's right. You did mention Fortnite though, which I thought was interesting, because I think of Fortnite as I call it a experience campfire. Essentially, it's a shared experience. And I actually think a lot of people would feel, who play that game, would feel like that is replacing a lot of social interaction that they would otherwise have offline. And for that reason, it's very much a sort of binding people together. It's creating a new world. It's having an experience together. Do you see that playing out in other ways? And do you feel like that's a healthy expression of what you're talking about?
I mean, it's definitely happening in other ways. And there's some cool examples elsewhere. I mean, in so many ways, I think people who've not been able to live the way that the majority of us were living before COVID are the leaders here.
Yeah.
So if you look like a community like Patients Like Me, for people who have a terminal diagnosis, for example, or a debilitating disease, there's been real powerful kind of online communities of accompaniment, of transparency, of intimacy that have existed in cool ways. I mean, less technologically interesting, I guess, but they're happening online. So that's for sure. I'm always really interested in fandoms, the way in which, obviously I'm in the Harry Potter world with the podcast.
I didn't even talk about that. Yes, as co-host of this podcast, which is in its own way a digital campfire. And so talk about that, because I think people would be interested to know, as someone who's built one.
Well, no, I think it's a great example, because you have the intimacy of audio, which already feels close, right? I know that I listen to podcasts and I feel like I'm friends with the hosts, even though I've never met them. Totally. So you have that kind of like imagined community. But what we've seen with Harry Potter and the sacred text is that there's now more than 90 local groups who get together and do sacred readings with the text. Of course, nearly all of them have now moved to do those online. But nonetheless, the kind of the listening community self-organized and found itself. And what's really cool is that in the last 4 months, both raising money for social justice causes, especially Black Lives Matter, but also organizing mutual aid groups for the whole podcasting community. And it's just, it's another way in which our kind of imagined and facilitated by technology communities can actually be practically helpful to each other.
Right.
Both dispersing money, but also signing up to be a listening buddy if someone wants someone to talk to, or creating art with someone and receiving their art. So really just lovely, sweet ways in which those relationships are being built in new ways. I think about the potential of kind of building on that infrastructure as one example of what the kind of spiritual infrastructure of the future might look like. rather than a traditional geographic disbursement of buildings that house congregations.
A spiritual infrastructure, is that a term? I love that. It's very helpful in understanding kind of what are we talking about here. It's a spiritual infrastructure. I'm into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really helpful. Right? So what do you feel like are the elements, you've just described a few, but of great communities? And do those differ whether the community is on or offline? You've talked us through a few, so it's people sort of finding meaning and connecting with a common purpose, and then the giving back element I think is a really big one.
Absolutely.
Are there any others that you feel like, oh my God, I see this over and over again?
The one that I care about a lot is the quality of the leadership.
I was just going to ask you about that. Please talk about that, because I think that gets lost so many times.
Yeah, and very, very often what we see in this landscape of new communities is that an individual will have an experience. They will go looking for a place where they can talk about it or like make meaning of it. They don't find something that works, so they create their own. And hopefully they'll find one or two other people to lead it with. Then after about 3 years, the individual will realize, oh, I've actually fulfilled the need that I had, and now I'm just meeting your needs, and I'm not getting paid.
Right.
And very often it'll lead to burnout and.
You froze for a second. You just said burnout. Go ahead.
So either they'll burn out and they leave, and often the whole organization closes, or there's a difficult leadership transition and it falls apart. Other ways that it can really be challenging is if the leader basically starts to meet their own needs in an unhealthy way, drawing on the community. And so that has led to instances of sexual assault, financial impropriety. All of the stuff that happens in congregations happens in these cool new communities too.
It's the same shit. It's the same.
Absolutely. And without any of the training or structures of accountability that are supposed to hold traditional religious institutions in place, they do not always work, clearly. But as we think about what those kind of healthy pieces of community are about, I think one of them is to certainly have shared leadership right from the very beginning, and also not just to recreate what very often happens is that people start with their friends and then they look around and we're like, oh, everyone's white, that's not great. Right. And it wasn't intentional, but it just started with the structures of society that we had. So there's so much intentionality in that leadership that's important from the very beginning, that I care really about what it means to resource those leaders personally, collectively, and even just like, how do those people get health insurance, right? Like how all of those really structural issues that are going to be necessary for this kind of new landscape to thrive, whether it's online or offline.
Yeah, it's so interesting because as you're talking, I think about tech products, right? Like technology products that are being, I feel like every single day there's new online communities that are born. And for whatever reason, as you talk, I think about an app like Clubhouse, which got a ton of early interest, and exactly what you just said is sort of, let's invite our friends. I do think that they did a good early job of curating a mix, so it was somewhat diverse, but they're in a situation now, for those who don't know on the call, where it's just, they've gotten a ton of flack for a lack of ability to actually police toxic behavior on the platform. It's an audio only social app. And it just made me think so much about sort of, how do you bake in the actual safeguards around that? How do you think about that before you start a community, whether it's for profit, not for profit, whether you're a brand or not, to protect against that, whether it's from a product point of view or from an actual human moderation point of view? It's so important, and I feel like it's going to become even more important as we have more choice in where we can actually go to do this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite thinkers to turn to on questions like that is Margaret Wheatley's work, who's written really beautifully about how communities grow and develop. And one of the things that she talks about, that Adrienne Marie Brown also has in her work on the kind of fractals, is what you put at the center is what's going to be everywhere. And so there's a real, and that's the who, but it's also the intentionality of what. And so it's really worth investing heavily up front in the conversations about how do we want to be together here? What are the kind of what's going to be okay and what's not okay, because what people see happening and getting away with is what happens everywhere very, very quickly. And then it's impossible to change. So yeah, that's the
I'd love to. Maybe we can pop her name in the chat for everybody, because I think that's a
absolutely.
really great resource.
I'll share one story of what that looks like, because one of my favorite communities, the Sanctuaries in DC, which was the last case study in How We Gather, was started by Eric Ressley, who was a white guy in DC, and was like, this is not going to work if I just get going. So he spent about 2 years just talking to people in coffee shops, like going to every meetup that he could find, building relationships with a very, very strong multiracial and multi-religious angle, and found a kind of cohort of leaders with whom he then started when the Sanctuaries launched officially, especially one co-founder, Osa. And I mean, it was still to this day the most inspirational vision of what a multiracial, multi-religious community around creativity, soul, and justice could look like. And even he, after about 4 or 5 years, couldn't find a financial model that made it work long term. So I really don't want to like overestimate how hard this is to do it really, really well. And I know so many people are trying.
Yeah. So I'm trying to pinpoint, I've been sort of thinking about like why community is having such a moment right now, because it is, right? Like it just is, like constantly hearing about it. And I saw something online about Maslow's hierarchy, which we've talked, you know, I've heard, and brands and brand strategists love to reference that because it feels sciencey. And really not. It's not, it's legit. I like learned this weekend, I was listening to Sam Harris's podcast. It's like, ooh, not at all. But how before COVID, but it's still a helpful framework, so I'm going to ask you about it. How before COVID, what we looked for from brands was kind of this self-actualization, the top of the pyramid. And now we're looking to fulfill the more basic needs, belongingness and love and safety, because that's where we are right now. This is what the world we're living in. And I realized, those more basic needs are the needs that community fulfills. And so it actually made me think about, you know, there's actually a cultural reason here why we're having this moment. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. This might be just my own theory.
Yeah, I honestly, I'm not sure I quite buy it, Sarah.
Okay, tell me. Yes.
Well, let me phrase it how I would, and then we can see where the differences are. I think what COVID and certainly then also the Black Lives Matter movement has done is usher in a moment of reckoning, of really interrupting life as it was and saying, is this what we want? Like, is this how we want to live? And the majority of people, I mean, the surveys from the UK, only 9% of people wanted to return to life as it was before COVID. Now, there can be 100 different reasons for why, but this sense of like, we have gotten our priorities wrong. And whether you want to look at mental health statistics, inequality statistics, there's such a strong evidence base that this was not working and we want it to change. And so I think one of the major hungers was just a sense of like, I want to be with the people I love. You know, we're working longer hours, all of that kind of stuff. So I think of this as a moment of reckoning and as a turn towards things of meaning, rather than necessarily a move up and down that hierarchy. Because that's the way that I think I would talk about it. But it's certainly the priorities have changed. I think that's very clear, or at least the brands are listening to that shift. But even 2 years ago, you know, Vice released a report kind of facing the marketing advertising world saying, hey, brands have moved into politics, right? The next white space is spirituality. So this has already been a long time coming, even from a brand perspective.
That's interesting. I actually didn't know about that paper. I'd love to see it. And I'm curious to know which brands you think are actually occupying that space well, or can they? And is this just a question that's just like, oh my gosh, we're looking to brands to fulfill something that actually we need to look into ourselves to fulfill?
Yes, Sarah, this is the question.
I feel like I just answered the question, but I didn't mean to. Continue.
Well, let's explore it, because I think on the one hand, you're right. Within the current framework of how brands behave and expect to be, it's not going to work. In fact, it's going to be harmful. Because if you're going to engage people's spiritual life, if you're going to engage the soul, you have to do it differently from how you would just engage with selling. I think there's an additional responsibility to do. And I wrote a piece with some of the folks at 21st Century Brands about, be careful because more will be demanded of you. And I think, so that's kind of point A. Point B is people are already going to brands with this like investment. I mean, the classic story that I often tell is the Soul Cycle instructor who gets a text message at 4 p.m. on a Sunday from one of her frequent riders saying, should I divorce my husband? And so like at that point, it's like, you can try and like back away gently from this reality, but people are already showing up with their spiritual lives and putting it in the hands of brands and private companies. So to some extent, I'm more interested in, okay, so how do we do it well and responsibly rather than trying to negate the engagement at all, because it's happening. And the workplace is another example. It's one of the few places where people are actively saying, I want a meditation class. Why don't we have a yoga room? It's because they somehow trust the workplace to offer this in a way that they wouldn't seek out somewhere else.
Right. It's very true. Esther Perel's podcast about work deals with this a lot. And it's super interesting. It's like we're placing a lot of stress on work to fulfill that for us. And I think the same is of brands.
And the final thing I'll say, because I definitely want to hear from others.
I was just going to open up.
The final thing is all of what I just said assumes the same kind of economic structure that we live in. Like if suddenly we shift to, whether it's universal basic income, if something shifts whereby we have more time to invest in community where we can gather without that gathering having to pay for someone's salary, I think the rules are very different. So I'm not coming in with a philosophical commitment towards Soul Cycle, like offering spiritual accompaniment, but within the rules as they are, I think it's one of the things we should explore.
Definitely. Well, I do want to open it up for questions. So anyone who has a question, just use the raise hand feature and I'll bring you in, or just pop your question into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. Oh, here we go. We have a question. So from Amanda, touching on an earlier point, what's the best way to find a balance between accessible spirituality through basic ritual versus the potential problem of commodifying spirituality where it can lose its value? Great question. I think that's super interesting.
Oof, Amanda. I love this. I was going to say, don't be shy with your questions. I just did an event with 17-year-olds. They're freaking brutal. They were like, why is that a bad thing? Does that mean religion sucks? And I was like, great questions, guys. Okay, what is the best way to find a balance between accessible spirituality? The way I think about it, Amanda, is if you imagine a pathway that starts there but goes deeper, then I think we're okay. I think if we see that first kind of accessible spirituality as the end result, then it's a problem. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, as we start practices intentionally, as we have, rituals and communities that are important to us, one of the most dangerous things is that we do it alone, and that we think we're done, because I think that's when it gets scary. And so finding whether it's someone who's a spiritual director or someone who offers spiritual accompaniment, or there's a community that continues to challenge us and invite us to go deeper and explore, that for me is a good sign of health, because soon enough you'll be taken beyond that kind of entry level. I don't want to make it like it's Mario Kart and you're going to go up to the next level, but there is some sense that the journey is always continuing. One of my favorite people in the world is an 86-year-old nun, and she says, I'm still becoming, and I'm like, yes, Sue, yes you are. So that journey never ends. There is no big boss in the sky that we have to defeat, I think, at some point.
Yeah, it's interesting that you Amanda, raised this idea of commodifying spirituality, because I've noticed a lot of brands have jumped on this idea of ritual and really tried to embrace it. Like there's a hair care brand called Crown Affair that keeps popping up in my feed, and it's all about sort of hair as a ritual, this and that. And it's like, I see this language pop up again and again.
Everywhere.
You talk to that,
Everywhere.
right? It's
but
like once you see it, you can't unsee it.
I don't have a problem with this at all. And I'm going to be a little controversial.
Yeah.
Because the relationship between money and religion has always existed. Like, I do not want to create some sort of pure, you know, like, oh, religion is all about transcendence and service. Screw that. Like, come on. You know, look at any history. And so, like, if it is genuinely, I mean, of course I have a problem if it's a bad product or a bad experience, or it does it, you know, of which there are many. But I actually don't have a kind of foundational issue, in part because living in the world that we do and the culture that we do, the way we know how to engage the world is by buying it. And that's very depressing. But there isn't, we think of ourselves as consumers even before we think of ourselves as citizens, very sadly. And so if that's the entry point, like, I actually don't have a huge problem with that, as long as there is a pathway beyond it.
Yeah, very much so. It's interesting because it's a contrarian point of view, but I like it. Yoav, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. You have a question.
Hi, Casper. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for doing this.
Hi.
Okay, Casper. So here's what I want to try to unpack for a second. I think that there's an interesting question of causality or correlation between the trends you've described around particularly brands, commerce, and trends, right? Because I could imagine a world in which we posited that the trend toward finding spiritual ritual moments in nature were driven by outdoor brands from the 1970s and 80s pushing us into the outdoors, right? Patagonia, REI, et cetera, right? And forcing us to think about that and forcing us outside, which obviously also intersects with trends, you know, in terms of urbanization and suburbanization, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if you can sort of try to unpack those respective trends, both historically and sociologically, as well as economically, and how they might intersect around these questions of ritual.
Oh, Yoav, so good. Yeah,
such a great question.
It's all highly contested. Like, if reading around like why we're in this moment of religious disaffiliation, there's so many different good answers for it. One of them including like women entering the workforce in the second half of the 20th century, which, you know, took away the free labor of women running congregations, for example. So I absolutely take your point of, can we prove causality in a public policy classroom context? Not so easily. But is it a story that makes sense to me? Yes. I think, I mean, one of the other ones, which is really powerful, I think, especially for the people who didn't necessarily attend religious congregations, but still describe themselves as a Methodist, was the politicization of religion in the 90s. So the moral majority focused on the family, and the way in which religion became really identified with a right-wing political perspective. That, I think, is why we saw such a rapid drop in the last kind of 2 decades of how people describe themselves. But it's a good question. They're all, of course, interrelated. They're all interlocking. So that's an unsatisfying answer.
But I do want to say, I do think there's there's a lot of bigger forces at work other than just the crumbling of religious institutions. It's basically every institution. Like, I mean, science is under, you know, it's crumbling. Like, it's sort of every major marriage. Like, we're not relying on these systems. I mean, this is I feel like we're grasping at straws to find other things to hold on to. And brands I would say brands and the workplace are 2 of those things. And to a certain extent, our intimate relationships as well. I mean, I've heard some really interesting analysis about, you know, we're leaning too heavily on our marriages to do the thing that the community and religion and all these other things we're supposed to do. So it's like we're leaning on these other mini institutions a lot more.
The final one I would mention is the development of the internet. I just think that is the big shift in terms of so much of our organizing behaviors and principles for our lives. I'm really interested, this is kind of a separate conversation, but like how it's going to change our understanding of what God is, if anything. Just the way that technology has shaped our language, right? I'm going to download this conversation, I'm going to whatever. Our understanding of what divinity is always shaped by our cultural and physical surroundings. And so, you know, we're not going to talk about wheat fields anymore. We're going to talk about desktops. And so that I find also just absolutely fascinating. So maybe the technological advance that we're in is ultimately the biggest driver. Just like, you know, the domestication of horses changed the way we waged war. I think the development of the internet will do the same.
That's very true. I'm going to take a question from Ezra. Ezra, do you want to come on in and ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Casper. Nice to see you again. I'm curious, and you had just sort of briefly touched on it, and the inclusion of this idea of like a hair care as like, yeah, that's ritual too, bring it all in. And I'm curious, in writing a book around ritual and really naming what it is, it also seems like you're naming what it's not. And I'm wondering where and when is it important for you to draw boundaries around what isn't a ritual? Because I agree, you see that word everywhere now, and maybe it's growing, and maybe that's good. But like, no, your morning coffee isn't a ritual. You're just making coffee.
Why are you coming for me, Ezra?
Like, here's the technology, here's the spiritual technology for how to make it a ritual, but like, you don't just get to call it a ritual and feel good about yourself.
Spoken like a true protector and innovator of a beautiful tradition. Yes. So I was a little flippant in my answer before, and I absolutely understand and agree with you. But it's partly not, I don't think it's actually people's fault, because the language of routine, habit, and ritual are so interlocking most of the time that it actually takes some work to separate those two. And the way that I do that in the book is by speaking specifically around intention, attention, and repetition. That's, you know, like we've talked about, the idea of taking a habit and making it into a ritual. You need those kind of cinder blocks to separate them from just something that you do that feels good. Although, of course, that's the place to start when you want to build a ritual. I guess the second part to that question, although I absolutely appreciate the premise, is that it might not be a bad thing to have more and more people talking about their rituals, talking about, even if it doesn't fit within the confines that you and I would want to see, because it illustrates, or at least it offers a larger kind of a larger turn towards meaning and things of ultimate concern, rather than just the kind of commercial factors. What I'm drawing on here is my former boss, who worked in communicating around climate change, who said, I don't really care if people are recycling. I care if they are talking about recycling, because it normalizes a behavior. And so I'm kind of stretching that into a religious context, but it's interesting to me to think about a kind of mainstreamization, that's a new word for us on a Thursday afternoon, of spiritual practices, so that it doesn't feel foreign and abstract, but it can really feel like an everyday, like people have spiritual agency. So yes, but I totally understand the frustration, especially if there's no curiosity with it. There's kind of a self-satisfied like Instagram hashtag vibe. Then I'm totally with you.
I think we're constantly figuring it out too. Like, we're in this moment of intense figuring it all out. We are nearing the end. I'm going to take one more question from Lynn, but I am going to do the book giveaway portion of this. So basically, just the first 3 people to put your email into the chat, I will contact you to get a free book. So go.
Look at
put your emails in if you want. And this is how it's going to go, because it's the best way I know how with Zoom. All right, cool. We're going to take a question from Lynn. So Lynn says.
That was intense. That was.
I know. You guys, I didn't know. Tell me how to run a contest. This is my first rodeo at this. I'm figuring it out. Okay.
I loved it.
So Lynn says, with the 3 circles of connection, is there a path to move from the outer circle of, for example, online communities that are built around a momentary and close to anonymous engagement towards the middle circle of building a community with purpose and meaning together? Does that make sense? Lynn, if you're still here, please jump on into the conversation. I think you are, yes.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
Cool.
It's hard, honestly, Lynn, it's hard. I think the thing that would make it work is continued time. Or if you're starting, well, that's irrelevant to your question. Yeah, is time, like doing this over time. So one of the ways in which the outer circle is different from the inner circle, or the middle circle, in my conception, is that the outer circle, you don't necessarily recognize people, right? You don't know their names, you might never see them again. It's a smile shared on public transport. You know, it's a training that you go to with other people across the country, whatever. It's that kind of the crowd. And so that next level in that middle circle, there's some recognition. You know, I might know that your daughter is going to college this year. I might know just little details about people's lives. And so if there is some kind of sustained engagement over time, that those relationships can deepen from stranger to acquaintance or to friend ultimately. But I think it's really difficult to do unless there's some sort of boundary on the crowd, because there's very little incentive to stay connected over time. Yeah, that's an unsatisfying answer. Forgive me.
I think the boundary thing you said, though, is super important, because I see that over and over when there's no guardrails.
Totally.
A digital campfire / community really, disintegrates.
And you see this a lot. I see this a lot with congregations where they're like, oh, we're doing our service online. Let's make it open to everyone. And it's like, right. No, the whole point is that you want to maintain that sense of an usness. I don't want to see some random uncle on there. Like, come back here because I want to see the people who I would see normally. Because relationships in space have this really interesting, like, I don't want to hang out with a Trader Joe's checkout person on Zoom. Mm-hmm. I want to have a nice chat with them when I'm at the checkout.
It's all context.
Context specific, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Well, Casper, we're at the end of the hour. If anyone has any more questions, please go ahead and ask. But otherwise, this has been like just the beginning for me. Like I've learned so much from you already, and I can't wait to follow kind of everything that happens with this book and all the other interviews. So thank you so much for being part of this. And honestly, thank you to everyone else for all your great questions today. It was such a fabulous day. So thank you.
What an awesome crowd. Thank you so much. And Sarah, thank you so much for the work you've done. I know, especially for anyone who hasn't read the HBR article about online campfires, definitely read it. It's awesome.
Thank you.
And it's lovely to see so many of you here. Wow.
So great to see you. I will likely be doing a recap of this. And so if you're on the email list, you'll get that. And it'll just kind of include the TLDR of what you said. You know, I'm sure you love to be boiled down to sound bites. But really, and also buy the book. For everyone who didn't get it in the Western style shootout on this chat that I just did, buy the book. The link is in the chat. Thanks, guys.
Bye, friends. Thanks again so much.
Bye, Casper. Thanks.